Hello, everybody. I really appreciate everyone that's joined us today and is bearing with me through this for my presentation on hemp production methods, cost, and returns. For those of you who are unfamiliar with me, my name is Andrew Bish. I operate two companies, Bish Enterprises and Hemp Harvest Works. Bish Enterprises is a family-owned and operated business founded by my grandfather in 1976 and owned by my father, Brad Bish, and mother, Christy Bish. In addition to my parents, I'm proud to work alongside my brother, Jacob. We build large-scale custom headers, research headers, header accessories, and are famous in the combine community for our header adapters. In 2008, I founded Hemp Harvest Works to better sell and market our Bish products and that we identified had an opportunity in the burgeoning hemp industry. Along the way, we changed course and decided to bring in as many quality products and services that we could find that met the needs of today's hemp producer, whether it be a product Bish built or a competing product. Hemp Harvest Works has a goal of being the one place to go to find the products today's hemp producer needs to be successful. In addition to my day job, I serve as a member of the board of directors for the Hemp Industries Association. This includes president of the Nebraska chapter and director of the Colorado chapter, vice president of the Hemp Feed Coalition, and technical committee member of the U.S. Hemp Authority. Here are just a few photos of who I am and some of the experiences I've had in many different stages of hemp plant processing. I actually started working with grain and fiber varieties, as you can see from the photo in the bottom left with myself and my daughter in the bin of a combine, before we moved into the world of cannabinoid harvesting. So now that we've gotten through the boring stuff, let's get this kicked off and get into our conversation about how to grow hemp for cannabinoid production and come out cash flow positive. To start out, I'm sure you've seen a wealth of equipment options out there. Single row plant harvesters, draper headers on tractors for whole plant harvesting, forage harvesters with headers that chop the material in the field, or even stripper headers that can pick the tops off the plants, and certainly many more I'm not mentioning. So why is that? What's the purpose of having all of these different implements available? Because to date, there is no standard way of growing hemp for cannabinoid production. There are a wide array of practices going on in the marketplace today, mainly because of the lack of available data we've had access to in the past. All of this has led to a variety of solutions, but there's not yet one solution to address the multitude of methods in place in 2020. Today, I'm going to run through the differences in terms of input and output costs relative to horticultural and agricultural farming practices. So agricultural methods, we'll start off with horticultural methods. These plants are typically classified as lower plant population per acre, higher input costs of genetics, labor, etc., perceived higher cannabinoid content, and typically started from clones or seedlings. One thing to note about horticultural methods, they are much more intensive in terms of hands-on labor. And while not easy, if you do have machines and intend to operate using hand labor, this is likely the most likely method you'd choose. Compare this to growing hemp for cannabinoid production agriculturally. Agricultural methods are typically classified as higher plant population per acre, lower input costs on genetics and labor, perceived lower cannabinoid content, and typically started from seed. Agricultural methods require mechanical assistance and are, in my opinion, the future of how most cannabinoid production will occur moving forward. We'll still continue to need smaller plots that have more specialized cannabinoid profiles, and likely we'll see those grown horticulturally. However, when it comes to large-scale CBD production, the numbers on the upcoming slides explain why the future of cannabinoid production is most certainly going to be the agricultural method. So how do we know what the best method is or will be? We created a calculator to help us figure that out. So how do we define what best is? Well, for the purpose of this presentation, we'll simply define best as the method that yields the highest return on investment with the lowest risk factor. Let's take a look at how this tool works. So first, we have input data we've got to put in here. So we've got row spacing, plant spacing, the number of acres, and the expected weight per plant. These are all vital numbers to the equation. If you look at the right side, you'll see the returns based on those inputs. After this, we will put known input costs into the calculator. We'll be working with one known cost, which is your cost of genetics, whether that be a seed or a clone or a seedling, or possibly a tissue culture if you happen to be a researcher. On the right, the total input cost will be shown relative to the number of acres. For this example, we'll be using 1 acre. We also have chosen not to input any other costs, as there is such a potential variance that could occur. We're going to leave these fields blank so that we can simply discuss the basic inputs and outputs before trying to dive into more complex detail. There are many costs you should consider when doing your projections, and here are some of those other input costs you should be considering. Devaluation, equipment overhead, fertilizer, fuel, labor, pesticides, rent, taxes, upkeep, etc. So just keep those in mind when you're doing your own calculations. In addition to the inputs, we have to input our loss values and price returns. We generally assume a 50% pre-extraction loss when we do projections. This number considers all things prior to product going to extraction, including germination rate, males that were eliminated, harvest loss, handling loss, storage, and transportation loss. Depending on your method, this number may need to go up or down, but 50% is a safe number to work. 50% is a safe number for most people to work with. If you, for instance, were going to be combining the hemp in the field, we'd likely bump this number to 80 or 90% loss. We do the same thing for forage harvesting in dry conditions. You may actually lower this number if you have excellent germination, no males, and immaculate handling technique, but not likely. Stick with 50% or more, and you'll end up shooting yourself in the foot. The extraction loss is the loss rate experienced during extraction. Material is typically not lost during extraction, however, the cannabinoid content is lost. This loss rate increases when the purity of the processing increases. The more pure the product, the higher the rate of loss. For standard CBD extraction, we like to estimate a 60% loss. I'm sure a bunch of extractors are going to flood my inbox disputing this, but the data shows this to be the case. I'm sure there are some extractors out there that have lower loss rates than this. Actually, I know that. But again, 60% is a safe number. We also need to input our price returns here. Currently, the going rate for flour, which is based on percentage of CBD per pound, is about 75 cents. You may see this potentially lower or slightly higher. In addition, we're going to put the current cost of crude into this equation, which we are showing to be at about $500 per kilo at the time of this presentation. Again, this may be lower or higher depending on the situation at the time. The combination of all of these values end up coming together on our next slide. Actually, before we get to the next slide, I do want to point out that we'll be talking about gross revenue and net revenue. So I do want to take a moment and define these for everyone as it relates to the presentation. We will define gross revenue as potential revenue prior to input costs, and we will define net revenue as potential revenue after input costs. For a quick overview, we have multiple rows here of different pieces of data. Row 1 will show total flour in total flour in pounds. Row 2 will show the total flour in kilograms. Row 3, the total flour in pounds after pre-extraction loss. Row 4, the total flour in kilograms after pre-extraction loss. Row 5 will show the potential gross revenue before loss. Row 6, the potential gross revenue after loss. And row 7, the potential net revenue after loss. Ultimately, it's this bottom number that you really care about. Separate from the rows, the columns reflect the values relative to the amount of CBD or another cannabinoid of your choice that is known to be in the plant material. We've decided to highlight the 5% and 10% CBD columns because most people are within the range of these numbers. Yes, some of you grow high percent cannabinoid material, but the facts are simple. Most do not grow 12+% material. You can also see in the bottom row where net revenue starts to turn positive relative to the input costs we previously discussed. The gross revenue line above the net revenue line would be the number without the input costs taken out. If someone gave you free seed and you magically planted it for free, this would be your profitability line. Most of us then will be working off the bottom row. On this, you see where we've taken the data from the previous worksheet and put in graphical setting to show some important inflection points. We will show you when net revenue becomes positive, when gross revenue becomes equal to input costs, when net revenue equals input costs, and when our gross revenue doubles our input costs. For information's sake, you will typically see net revenue become positive at the same inflection point in which gross revenue becomes equal to input costs. You will also see net revenue being equal to input costs at the same inflection point in which gross revenue doubles the input costs. This next chart is focused on the extract profits based on the same calculations we've done prior. Again, we're going to keep a target on 5% and 10% cannabinoid content throughout this presentation. First thing to note, extract profits are considerably higher than flower profits. Keep in mind, we are not factoring the cost of extraction equipment or your cost to extract. The cost we are generating here would be what the potential revenue would be without tabulating the unknown costs of extraction build out or whatever negotiation may occur between a producer and a processor. Now that we understand a little bit about what we are looking at, let's take a look at some examples. Our first example will be a horticultural method. Our parameters for this will be, we're going to use clones at $3 each. We're going to plant in a 60-inch by 60-inch row spacing, plant spacing. We'll expect 1.5 pounds of material per plant. We're going to have a total input cost of $5,226, which again is just our genetics. And we will work with a current flower price of 75 cents per point per pound. As you can see from this chart, based on our input costs, we don't see that net revenue becomes positive until we achieve a minimum of 6% cannabinoid content. And this is only true if 1.5 pounds per plant is actually achieved. If the plant weight comes up short at this percentage, a grower would likely experience a loss of revenue. Something else to consider, the net revenue is at 6%. The net revenue at 6% is only $654 an acre here. If you have other input costs, which you most likely do, you're likely underwater with this setup at this percentage of cannabinoid content. Now, when you look at 10% cannabinoid content, net revenue is considerably more attractive at $4,575 per acre. At this rate per acre, you have a bit more flexibility if the plant weight were a little bit light. If you achieve a higher rate of cannabinoid percentage or a higher plant weight, you will see where net revenue increases. In this example, a 14% crop would then provide a net profit of $8,495 versus the 10% of $4,575 or 6% at $654 per acre. Each acre grown in this method is a risk of a minimum of $5,226. Our second example will be another horticultural method. Our parameters for this will be, we're going to use feminized seeds, this time at $1 per seed. We're going to plant it at 30-inch by 30-inch plant spacing this time. We're going to expect smaller plants, 1.2 pounds of material per plant. So that's a little less than the wider spacing. We're going to have a total input cost of our genetics, which will be $6,970. Now that's higher than example A, even though we're using 1/3 of the cost of the genetic input at $1 a seed versus $3 a seed. But because we're using just over 3 times the amount of seeds to achieve that, our costs are inflated. And we'll continue to work with a flower price per point per pound of 75 cents. So as you can see from this chart based on our input costs, we see net revenue become positive at 3% this time instead of 6% from the previous example. Again, all of this is only true if the 1.2 pounds per plant hold true. Net revenue becomes equal to input cost at 5% cannabinoid content. And if you were able to maintain a 1.2 pound per plant standing, if you achieve 10% cannabinoid content, you'll start to see quite improved margins and profitability overall. With this model, while you have considerably higher chance of profitability versus example A, your risk factor has gone up due to the input costs. Essentially, each acre grown in this method is a risk of a minimum of $6,970. So now that we've looked at a couple different horticultural examples, let's take a look at an agricultural example and start to discuss the differences. In this example, our parameters are going to be as follows. We're going to use a non-feminized seed at $10 a pound. We're going to use a 30-inch row spacing by 7-inch plant spacing because we're using a standard planter. We expect 0.1 pounds of material per plant, and we will have an input cost of $40. Current flower price per pound is still 75 cents. As you can see from this chart, based on our input costs, we see net revenue become positive at 1% cannabinoid content versus 3% or 6% from the previous two examples. Again, all of this is only true if the original weight calculation holds true. Net revenue becomes equal to input cost at 1% cannabinoid content. And if you achieve 5% cannabinoid content, you have a very, very healthy return on investment with minimum input risk relative to the horticultural methods listed previously. In this scenario, you have a $40 input, and at 5% CBD content, you have a profitability of $5,520.57. That's a pretty reasonable rate of return on the $40. Keep in mind, we haven't inputted other input costs here, and the tractor isn't free, and they don't run off solar power. So keep this in mind and be sure to add in those fixed costs into your equation. Now we'll get to our final example. And our final example will be another agricultural method. Our parameters for this will be as follows. We'll again use a non-feminized seed variety. We're going to price this out at $10 a pound. And we'll use 7-inch row spacing and 2.5-inch plant spacing because we are using a standard drill. We expect 0.015 pounds of material per plant. And we will have an input cost of $200. Again, we're sticking with a 75 cents per pound. In our final chart here, based on our input costs, we see net revenue again become positive at 1% CBD content, similar to the last example. Again, this is weight dependent, and if you over or undershoot your estimates, these numbers will obviously change. And again, net revenue becomes equal to input costs at 1% cannabinoid content, and if you achieve 5% cannabinoid content, you have a very healthy return on investment with minimum input risk relative to the horticultural methods listed previously. In this scenario, you have a $200 input, and at 5% CBD, you have a profitability of $9,661.03. That's an amazing rate of return on a $200 investment. Again, keep in mind, we haven't inputted our other operational input costs here. You still need a tractor and a drill for this scenario to work out. So be sure to factor in all of that kind of information. So let's talk about the pros and cons of all of this. Well, let's take a look at the horticultural method first. Pros and cons of horticultural growing. Well, the pros, higher concentration of cannabinoids in flower, usually, not always true. I'm sure people out there have experienced that. More boutique varieties are definitely available. They can be marketed as smokable flower. Many processors are available to extract this type of material, and it's very possible to perform small grows without heavy machinery costs. Some of the cons would be very high seed costs, very high labor costs, easy to devalue the material. There's large margins for error. It's much harder to scale. It's more difficult to find appropriate machinery to plant, cultivate, and harvest, and it does have a very high overhead risk. Now, when we look at the agricultural method, some of the pros would be a much lower input cost. It's much easier to scale, and machinery used is less labor intensive. Some of the cons would be lower concentration of cannabinoids in flower typically, less genetic options available, and it's harder to find extractors that will process the lower percentage material. This final point is a very, very important one. It's great to see some of the risk reward numbers relative to agricultural methods, but at the end of the day, you do need to find an extractor, or you need to find an extraction system. Throughput efficiency may make certain lower percentage material impossible to extract due to solvent costs and other costs associated with extracting. Be sure to have an extraction solution sourced prior to going forward with this type of operation. And some quick general industry constraints to mention relative to all of what we talked about. There is a lack of available low CBD processors out there. That's something to keep in mind, especially when you're looking at the agricultural method. There is a sincere lack of available genetics that are both certified and economically viable, and that is regardless of the method that you choose. And finally, there is a general lack of industry standards, which make, I suppose, for the opportunity for all of us to have come together today to discuss these topics in general. So I guess that's the positive to that. For a recap, there are lots of ways of growing hemp. There are lots of ways of growing corn or soybeans or wheat for that matter. But in order to identify the best option for you in your situation, we do have to look at the facts and the risk factors. Each example I gave today had its own set of risk factors, whether it be the high genetics cost or high upfront cost of machines. You need to be aware of the risks we discussed today, but also the risks that will affect you in your area of the world, as each microclimate has its own inherent risk factors as well. Solutions viable in the past will not remain viable if the economics around them change, and the economics have changed quite dramatically in the course of the past 12 months. Most importantly, hemp is still a very profitable crop to grow. If you properly take into account your risk factors and then develop a good game plan around them, you can have success. There is tremendous opportunity for smart growers to be very successful in the cannabinoid market in 2020. Thank you everyone for your time today. I look forward to seeing many of you throughout the growing season this year. I also want to thank the Hemp Industries Association for allowing us all the opportunity to have this discussion today. So good luck and Godspeed, everyone. And I do want to open it up to questions. I want to do this. If anybody has any questions, I'm going to pull up the little note screen here and see what questions people may have. Bear with me. Okay. So one of the questions was, are we allowing the agriculture method pollination to occur, or are we pulling males from the field? Great question. No, we're presuming in an agricultural method that you are leaving the males in the field. So the plant material projections take into account males as well as females growing out there. And basically, when we talk about per plant, we're actually taking acreage figures and then dividing over the number of plants. So there's going to be a number of plants that actually don't really have material. That's a great question. Another question was, how do you calculate labor for culling males? That's definitely a tough one. All I can say on that is you have to look at your experience with that particular genetic variety. I've seen people put in tremendous amount of effort and labor towards culling males, and then I've seen people that didn't have to put in more than 10 hours a year doing it. So that one is not something that I have a good calculator for, and I do apologize for that. Somebody asked if it's possible to gain access to the software. So we'd be happy to provide examples for people if they've got some inputs they'd like to provide us. We could share those back. We're not quite prepared to release the spreadsheet yet, as we have some tweaks we'd like to make. I'd hate to have provide a spreadsheet that somebody accidentally modified and was spitting out the wrong data. So we're trying to find a way to distribute that in a way that might be effective and hopefully we'll have a solution here in the next few months for that. I have a question. Why is it difficult to find low CBD hemp extractors? Well, most of the hemp extractors that I've come in contact with have been set up to do higher throughputs, to do higher CBD percentages, which gives them a higher throughput rate. The costs of doing lower CBD production start to go up because you do have to use more solvent relative to the amount of CBD content. And some extractors don't have processes that are efficient enough to allow that to work. That's basically the long and short of that. A lot of extraction systems can be modified and change so that they will work through low CBD processing, but because there hasn't been quite a demand out there in the marketplace for it, we haven't seen a lot of processors, at least in the United States, come up that are doing low cannabinoid processing. That is different when you get into Canada. We do see quite a few processors in Canada that are doing very low CBD percent processing. So it just seems to be more in the United States. Somebody asked how the economic viability changed in the past 12 months. Well, when you look at it realistically, we're talking about 75 cents a point per pound today, and a little over approximately a year ago, we were up to about $3.70 per point per pound. So just a dramatic decrease in overall potential profitability. And that's part of the reason that it makes sense to start penciling in these numbers. It made sense last year to start penciling in the numbers, but the numbers were so big, it was hard to fathom for a lot of people. But relative to the economic viability, I do think there's more. Well, the math shows that there's currently more profitability in growing hemp than there is growing some of the other commodities. I got a question about harvesting the tops first for CBD extraction. How many pounds would an acre produce? That's a great question. When we figure out these numbers, what we're doing is we're looking at historical values that we've seen out from actual experience in the field. And I haven't had a tremendous amount of just cutting the tops off. But when we talk about growing for agricultural purposes, we are typically leaving a lot of the stock in the field and taking off, half to potentially 2/3 of the plant. So if you were to go through that same field and pull off just a lesser percentage, we could do some quick math to identify what that looks like. But what we try to identify is what is the pounds per acre a particular variety produces in a particular way of growing, and then we work the math off of that. And then a question here: what's going on with the biomass? And is this the same equipment harvesting for fiber, grain varieties, as well as CBD production? Well, the word biomass I don't like in general, because with the hemp commodity, biomass can mean a lot of different things. If you've got seed in sacks, that's biomass. If you've got flour in sacks, that's biomass. If you've got sticks in a pile, that's biomass. If you've got flour and sticks, that's biomass. If you've got flour, sticks, and seeds, that's biomass. So biomass is a tough word to use, but the equipment that we're using for CBD production versus grain production, there can be some differences in that. Typically, again, when we're harvesting for grain, we're trying to use some sort of combine so that you can thresh the stock, or thresh the plant, and then separate the seed from the stalk and the flower. There's a way to capture the byproduct out of the back of the combine, but the header, I just typically wouldn't use a combine if my primary focus was to grow for cannabinoid content. And so in that regard, I would use a different implement with a different type of header if I was going to harvest just cannabinoids versus doing some sort of dual crop. What is the estimate for the national 2020 hemp crop in terms of percentage fiber versus grain versus CBD versus CBG? That's a great question. I don't know the answer, but I can tell you that we will see a dramatic increase in both grain and fiber production in 2020 relative to 2019. I am nervous that we are going to see a large amount of CBG being grown. And the reason I say that is because there is a lot of genetics in the marketplace. People have gotten very excited about CBG. Unfortunately, the people that are excited about CBG happen to be people that have already worked inside of the hemp industry that understand the benefits of CBG, and the public does not know the benefit of CBG. And it's going to be a very difficult product to market to the public, where CBD has a lot of, well, it has a lot more legs currently. Not that that won't change, but I do see that CBG is likely to be overgrown almost instantly. And then is there currently an oversupply of CBD biomass flower like we often hear, or is the end consumer CBD market available and there just isn't enough processing facilities online? In other words, is there a bottleneck at processing? Well, there definitely is a lot of flower out there. I think part of it is there is some potential oversupply, although we're never really going to know the answer to that until the USDA starts doing appropriate growth studies and actually provides the data as to how many acres were grown, how many acres were harvested, so that we can put those numbers together. But there are some bottlenecks in terms of processing in the way that oftentimes people that have hemp available that processors want aren't necessarily aware of the fact that the processor wants their particular type of hemp. Meanwhile, processors are dealing with hemp varieties that maybe aren't meeting their specs. And that just has to do with a lack of developed marketplace that we have right now, as well as a lack of, the lack of developed marketplace is where it is, and the lack of standards. Once we have baseline standards for CBD production in terms of how it's delivered, what the percentages should look like, what the moisture levels should look like, things like that, it's going to be hard to really resolve some of these bottlenecks when it comes to processing. Well, those are some great questions, everybody. I do appreciate everyone's time today. And I do, again, apologize sincerely for the way the presentation got started. Sometimes I struggle with technology, and why not do it in front of 80 people? So that's what we did today. But I do appreciate everyone sticking with me. Thank you all for your time, and I'm going to go ahead and close the presentation down now. Have a great day, everyone.